It was the kind of morning that made you feel suspended in time, colorless, scentless, and sickly quiet. When Elise received the letter that would undo the already fragile stitching of her internal world, the soft, unseen threads that had held her together since childhood, since the funeral no one talked about, since the day her mother locked herself in the bathroom and never spoke again. The letter came without ceremony, in an envelope that seemed too heavy for something so small, its paper thick like skin, damp at the edges, as if it had wept its way into a mailbox from another place altogether. There was no return address, only her name in sharp, angular strokes that felt carved rather than written. Not Elise Morgan, as her legal documents would have it, but Elise Ann Eldridge, a name she hadn't heard since she was 10, spoken in the brittle voice of her Uncle Thomas, a man she remembered only in broken snapshots. The scratch of his beard against her forehead, the way he used to tap the windows at night and smile as though the house itself had whispered something amusing to him. She didn't open the letter for hours. It lay on the kitchen table, between a half-eaten apple and an empty mug, demanding attention without urgency, like a living thing pretending to sleep. When she finally slit it open, it exhaled a scent she could not name, a distant mineral tang that reminded her of wet stone, old photographs, and rust. Inside, there was a handwritten note, a legal document bearing the seal of a solicitor's office in Wiltshire, and a long iron key, blackened by time, cold as ice despite the warmth of the room. The note was brief, the ink faded, yet unsettling in its clarity. To Elise, the house is yours now. Treat it with care. Never ignore it. T.E. At first, she laughed, or something like a laugh, a short, strangled sound that died in her throat. Uncle Thomas had died nearly a year ago, hadn't he? She vaguely recalled seeing his obituary mentioned in an email from a distant cousin, the kind she only heard from during holidays or funerals. She hadn't gone. There had been no reason to. He had been nothing more than a ghostly curiosity in her memory, a figure painted in whispers and sideways glances. And yet now, here he was again, posthumously reaching across time and silence, offering her a house she didn't know existed, with instructions that felt less like advice and more like a warning. She told herself she wouldn't go. She told herself again the next day. And yet, 4 days later, she stood at the edge of a narrow gravel path, suitcase in one hand and the heavy iron key in the other, staring up at the house that had once belonged to the man who had vanished from her life without explanation. It stood at the crest of a hill, surrounded by blackened trees that creaked with a wind she couldn't feel, their twisted branches reaching skyward like the hands of something long buried. The house itself was wrong in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Not ruined, not decayed, but ancient in the way a fossil is ancient, preserved and alien, as though it had been placed there by something that did not fully understand what a house was meant to be. Its windows were tall and narrow, arranged in patterns that defied symmetry, staring down at her like glass eyes set into a skull. The stone walls were mottled with lichen and shadow, and the front door, impossibly tall, too narrow, seemed to lean slightly inward as if listening. And there, carved into the wood just above the handle, she saw the faint outline of a sigil or symbol. something abstract and organic, a shape her mind refused to grasp fully, recoiling each time she tried to focus on it. She inserted the key. It resisted her at first, as though the lock had forgotten what it meant to open, but then it turned with a click so loud it echoed through her bones, and the door swung open without a touch. The air inside was thick, warm and motionless, heavy with the scent of lavender over something else, something metallic, faint but unmistakable. The foyer stretched out before her like the inside of a throat, dim and lined with old wood that seemed to tremble faintly in the periphery of her vision. There were no sounds, no birds outside, no creak of the trees, no hum of electricity. Even her own footsteps seemed muffled, like sound was being swallowed whole by the very structure around her. The house did not feel empty. She walked through the first floor in slow, halting steps, each room revealing itself like the page of a dream she did not remember having. A drawing room with dust-covered chairs arranged around a black fireplace that hadn't seen flame in years. A library where the books leaned together like co-conspirators, the spines too worn to read. A dining room with a long, unfinished table, its surface scarred as though something had once clawed at it. And everywhere, mirrors, small ones in corners, full-length ones in narrow hallways, their glass dusty but unbroken, their reflections slightly wrong, a fraction of a second delayed, a flicker too fast, a shadow that moved when she did not. It was only when she reached the foot of the stairs that she noticed the temperature. Not a drop in degrees, but a shift in sensation, a sudden awareness of her own heartbeat, her own breath, her own skin. The air was watching her. No, not the air. The house. It watched without eyes, listened without ears, breathed without lungs. She felt it, a pressure behind her eyes and deep in her teeth, a hum in the base of her skull that intensified when she stood still too long. And when she turned to leave, just for a moment, the hallway behind her seemed longer than it had been before. She did not speak aloud, not yet. But in the stillness of the house, her silence felt like a sin. She stayed that night, not because she wanted to, but because the idea of leaving, of turning her back to the house, filled her with a dread so pure and primal that it hollowed her out from the inside. The bedroom was small, unfurnished, save for a narrow bed and a wardrobe with a cracked mirror. She lay there, eyes open, hands clenched, and listened to the house breathe around her. The slow creak of wood, the settling groan of stone, the almost imperceptible whisper of something just beyond the edge of hearing. And then, from somewhere deep within the walls, a voice, low and soft, not words but rhythm, a pulse, a murmur. "Don't ignore me." Her eyes snapped open, though they hadn't been closed. The house had spoken, and something inside her, something buried deep, had listened. It began with the floorboards. Not a sound, no creak, no groan, not the usual protests of old timber settling, but a pattern. Elise noticed it on her second full day in the house, just after sunrise, when the light outside was still weak and colorless, as if the sun had yet to make up its mind. The boards beneath her feet grew colder in certain places, warmer in others, shifting subtly as she moved through the corridor, like a body breathing beneath her steps. At first, she thought it might be some trick of the house's age or a draft crawling up from some hidden crevice. But the more she walked, the more she became certain the house was remembering her, step by step, imprinting her presence onto its skin, reacting not just to her movements, but to her attention, to her thoughts. There was no comfort in the rooms, though they were mostly furnished. They had a sterile quality, as if they had been set in place not for living but for performance, as though the house had once observed how people should behave in rooms and arranged itself accordingly. Chairs placed near windows that no one could sit in without the light stabbing their eyes. Tables lined with untouched linen stained faintly by age, but still crisp like untouched stage props. And everywhere that soft, persistent pressure, like something standing just behind her, always just behind, never seen. She wandered without purpose, led more by instinct than design, until she found herself in what appeared to be an old study at the back of the house. The room was colder than the others and darker despite its large window. A desk stood near the far wall, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust that shimmered in the pale light, undisturbed. No papers, no pens, nothing to suggest work had ever been done here. Just the desk, the window, and a tall, narrow bookshelf lined with old volumes whose titles were nearly unreadable, the ink on their spines having long since faded into the leather. One book stood out. Not because it was newer. It wasn't. If anything, it looked older than the rest. But it was perfectly centered on the shelf, its spine pristine as though it had never been touched or opened. Elise reached out, and the moment her fingers brushed the leather, a sudden chill shot up her arm, like a wire pulled taut between her hand and her shoulder. She flinched, withdrew. But then, curiosity overruled instinct, and she pulled the book free. No dust, no scent of age or decay. Inside, a name, Thomas Eldridge. And below it, in that same sharp, angular hand that had written the letter, "This house needs an ear. It has none of its own. It listens through us. And sometimes it speaks back." Elise stood frozen for a long time, the book cradled in her hands like a sleeping child she was afraid to wake. The handwriting didn't surprise her. She had expected to find him here, in some form. But it was the phrasing, the calm, methodical tone of a man who had long since accepted something unbearable, something that should have broken his mind, but instead became routine. She turned the page. At first, I thought the sounds were normal, pipes, rats, wind. Then I noticed they answered me. Not in words, in rhythm, in response. I'd cough, and a board would creak 2 rooms away. I'd hum, and the windows would tremble. I ignored it for too long. That's when the mirrors began. There was more, pages of it, observations, accounts, dated but erratic, as though he had written in bursts, during moments of fear or clarity or madness. She couldn't tell. Most entries ended abruptly, without punctuation, as if he had been interrupted or decided he had said enough. She turned another page and found a torn section, as if something had been violently removed. Her heart raced, not with fear exactly, but a dreadful anticipation, the sensation of standing at the edge of something vast and sentient and far too deep to comprehend. That night she did not read aloud. She barely moved. She sat in the corner of her bedroom, the book in her lap, staring at the wardrobe mirror. It was a simple thing, old and speckled, its surface warped in places from time and moisture. But in the dark, it felt enormous, more like a hole than a reflection, a mouth with no voice. She watched it as the hours passed, waiting for it to twitch, to shimmer, to show her something she hadn't seen. It never did, but still, she could not sleep. The house did not creak. It breathed. She heard it in the walls, in the corners of her mind, a slow exhale that never turned to inhale, as though the whole place was constantly sighing with some ancient, withheld grief. And somewhere deep within her, Elise began to understand. The house wasn't haunted. It was the haunting. It did not contain something monstrous. It was the monster. And now it remembered her. By the third morning, Elise had stopped checking the time. Not because she had no need for it. There was still a rhythm to her days, dictated by the dim light that filtered through warped glass and the slight changes in the weight of the air, but because time in the house felt deliberately wrong, like something the structure itself resented. Her watch slowed inexplicably during the night and ran too fast by noon. Even her phone, which she had kept off in an effort to embrace some imagined quietude, flickered with irregular battery readings when she turned it on. 63%, then 14%, then 91%, before blinking out entirely. It was not just a house, it was an organism. Or worse, something between organism and intelligence. Something old and exhausted and deeply awake. She began to speak to it. Not out of madness, or not at first, but because the silence had thickened into a presence that pressed against her like fog on her skin. She spoke casually at first, narrating what she was doing as she dusted surfaces or heated tea on the old stove. She didn't ask questions. She didn't expect answers. But each word lifted a thin veil from her mind, and with every passing hour, she felt the house breathing easier, as if it liked to be acknowledged. In the evening, she found the second journal, this one hidden inside the hollow of a false book labeled Ecclesiastical Architecture, 1780-1843. It was thinner than the first and handwritten in a looser, more fevered hand. The ink bled in places, and the pages were often stained at the corners with fingerprints, some faded brown, some almost black. What chilled her was not the journal's content, though it was terrible in its own right, but the fact that it responded to the entries in the first journal, sometimes quoting them, sometimes correcting them. No, not mirrors, mouths. The glass doesn't reflect. It remembers. It shows what the house wants us to become. Thomas was wrong. It doesn't speak through walls. It speaks through us, or tries. The house is like a throat, and we are the rasp at its back. If we are quiet long enough, it will use our silence to speak its own words. Elise read the journal by the narrow light of a single desk lamp that seemed to hum in tune with her heartbeat. Outside the room, the air grew thick again, an unseen storm gathering in the walls, some electric, wordless pulse radiating from the corners. She tried to ignore it. She tried to breathe slowly, to ground herself in her body, to tell herself this was grief, or madness, or the return of some childhood delusion. But when she looked up and saw the mirror across the room, the one fixed to the armoire, the one that had remained clouded and inert for days, she saw something move behind her. It was not a reflection. There was no delay, no distortion, no optical trick. It moved before she did, standing at a sharper angle, head tilted to a posture she never assumed, fingers clenched when hers were loose. It wore her face, but not her eyes. It did not blink, and its mouth hung just slightly open. She turned. The room was empty. She turned back. The figure was closer. A breath caught in her throat, not fear, but recognition, and not of the figure, but of something behind it, in the mirror itself, a suggestion of depth, a corridor or tunnel lined with frames, dozens of them, all mirrors staring into one another, echoing on and on, narrowing into blackness. There were others, she thought, standing in them, people or things that had worn her shape in older lives, long before she arrived, versions of her that had stayed too long, or spoken too little, or looked too deeply into the glass. She slammed the mirror shut. The wood of the armoire groaned like a body waking from sleep. She did not sleep that night. The next morning she found footprints. Small ones, bare, human, childlike. They appeared on the second-floor hallway just outside her door, leading from the far corner near the unused guest room to the base of her bed. No dust had been disturbed elsewhere. No other signs of life. No creaking stairs or whispered laughter. Just the prints, precise, wet as though left by a recent rain, and slightly too long in the toe. She followed them back to the guest room. The door had been closed the night before. Now it stood open by an inch, just enough to see the edge of a bed and the outline of a figure seated at the far wall. Elise didn't enter. She stood in the hallway, unmoving, listening. The house was silent again, that dreadful, hollow silence that felt constructed, as if the very molecules of air had been arranged into some cruel architecture designed to keep sound out. And in that silence, she heard the faintest scraping. Not breathing, not movement, writing. Like a pen dragged across paper with deliberate, unbroken motion. She stepped back, and the door closed softly in front of her. Later, when she returned to the study to retrieve the second journal, she found a new page, one she hadn't written, one that hadn't been there before. The ink was dry. The handwriting was not her own, nor was it Thomas's. You looked into the mirror. You heard me. That is the first lesson. Soon you will understand what it means to be the tongue. Beneath the words, something had been etched into the paper, deep enough to score the desk below. A symbol. Twisting, serpentine, familiar, the same shape carved above the front door. She closed the journal, and for the first time Elise began to wonder if the house had chosen her long before her uncle ever died. There was something buried beneath the house. Elise didn't know how she knew, only that she did. Like a word caught at the back of the tongue, just shy of pronunciation, or a memory too raw to become thought. It pressed up from under the floorboards, coiled deep in the soil, a constant tension beneath her feet that pulsed, not with life, but with intention. Not an object, not a structure, a presence. And it was growing restless. The house had begun to change. Not in ways she could describe to someone else. There were no vanishing rooms or bleeding walls, no grotesque transformations that might belong in stories of ghosts or madness. No, the changes were subtle, insidious, designed to fray the edges of reality with gentle insistence. Her hallway seemed longer than before, though she counted the steps. A door now opened to a different room than it had yesterday. The shadows pulled more quickly in the corners, stretching their fingers toward her even in daylight. The mirrors were the worst. They multiplied. There had only been 6 she could remember when she arrived. Now there were 10, then 15, then 23. Some large and ornate, others small and cracked. Some that she was certain hadn't existed the day before, but appeared now like teeth erupting through gum. She covered one with a sheet from the linen closet. The next morning, the sheet was folded neatly on the floor, and the mirror had been cleaned. She tried to write, to mark the passage of time, to ground herself in ink and paper. The words resisted her. Sentences unraveled on the page, letters twisted in ways she couldn't recall forming. Sometimes, she'd look down and find that she had written the same line over and over again. It needs a mouth. It needs a mouth. It needs a mouth. She burned that page in the fireplace. The smoke smelled not of ash, but of iron and wet stone, and it clung to her skin for hours. That night, she dreamt of roots. Not tree roots, but something deeper and older, too symmetrical to be natural and too hungry to be still. In her dream, the floor of the study split open with a groan like ancient wood snapping under pressure, revealing a spiral staircase descending into wet soil. She saw herself descend. Not a vision, her actual self, walking down and down, eyes wide open, mouth slightly parted, whispering in a language she had never spoken. Her hands were bloodless, fingers twitching like antennae. And as she disappeared into the blackness below, a voice rose from the pit, not in words, but in a rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat, vast and uneven. When she awoke, her fingernails were packed with dirt. The scent of earth clung to her bed sheets. On the 5th day, she found the locked door. It stood behind a tapestry on the ground floor hallway, something she had ignored until now. An old velvet curtain depicting a scene she couldn't interpret. A kneeling figure offering its tongue to a many-eyed creature that towered like a cathedral behind it. She had never bothered to move it before, but now, drawn by some invisible thread of thought, she pulled it aside and found the door. Iron-bound, narrow, fitted so tightly into the wall that it looked almost sculpted from the stone. It had no handle, only a small, circular impression at its center, just wide enough for the iron key. Her heart thudded heavily. Not from fear exactly, but from a resonance, as though something deep beneath her had stirred at her discovery. Her breath caught as she removed the key from her pocket. It had grown warmer in recent days, almost hot, as if absorbing the heat of her body or feeding on her pulse. She fit it into the impression. It slid in with unnatural ease, and as she turned it, the walls seemed to draw inward, tightening like muscle around bone. The door did not open with a creak. It exhaled. The staircase was there, just like in the dream. Elise didn't descend. Not yet. She stood at the top for a long time, unable to move, feeling the pull of the stairwell like gravity redefined. The air that rose from below was damp, close, filled with the scent of stone and rot and something deeper. An aroma that made her eyes water, not from its pungency, but because it smelled like something that should not exist. She closed the door. The key resisted her, like a thing reluctant to leave its home, but she forced it free and backed away, heart pounding, the sound of her breath loud in her ears. As she stepped backward down the hallway, she felt every mirror she passed turn slightly toward her, their angle imperceptibly altered, their glass fogging with breath she hadn't released. Later, while searching for more of her uncle's writings, she opened a drawer in the library she had never noticed before. Inside, a letter addressed to her, sealed in black wax. The paper was brittle, the ink uneven, scrawled in a hand more desperate than the others she had seen. Elise, if you are reading this, then the house has already opened itself to you. That is its nature. It will never force. It invites. You have already accepted the invitation, simply by listening. It will not harm you as long as you remain useful. Speak to it. Let it echo through you. Read to it. Talk to it. Sing if you must. Silence makes it hungry. The door below leads to the source. I never went. I never had the strength. Perhaps you do. Or perhaps it chose you because you'll say what I would not. T.E. That night, Elise lit every lamp she could find. She played music aloud from her dead phone, though it had no charge. She recited poetry from memory, whispered old nursery rhymes, sang broken lullabies. The house listened. She felt it pressing closer, like a child leaning toward the warmth of a storyteller. And just before dawn, as she stood in front of the wardrobe mirror, her reflection opened its mouth and said in her own voice, "Go down." She did not scream. She did not cry. She only nodded. Because the house was patient, and now it was waiting. There was no longer any meaningful difference between day and night inside the house. Though the sun may have still risen beyond the warped windows and the bone-colored curtains, the light that filtered into the halls seemed filtered through something far older than glass, like parchment soaked in water and held over a dying flame. The warmth of it was no comfort. It was weak, sour, and strangely delayed, as if the rays had passed through miles of stone before reaching her skin. Elise did not sleep. She only rested now and then, leaning against walls that pulsed faintly beneath her shoulder blades, bones aching from constant alertness. Even in silence, she found herself mouthing words, fragments of poetry, scraps of overheard conversation, the names of streets she remembered from her childhood, as if her body, acting on instinct, feared what would happen should her voice fall still for too long. The door beneath the tapestry called to her in pulses. It had no voice of its own, but it knew how to mimic. She heard her uncle sometimes, in the pipes, her mother from the study floorboards. Once, horribly, she heard her own voice coming from the inside of a mirror, repeating a sentence she had never spoken. "We are the language of stone." And so she went to the door. Not out of courage, but because not going had become impossible. Avoidance was no longer a choice. It was an act of violence against something ancient and aware, and the house responded with subtle cruelties. Her hair tangling impossibly in her sleep, her water tasting like dust, her own heartbeat skipping at intervals as if another rhythm had been introduced beneath it. The key slid in easily again. The lock accepted her like a mouth swallowing a word. The door opened with no protest, revealing the same spiral staircase from her dream, winding down into earth so dark it swallowed light completely after the second turn. She took a flashlight, of course, and a journal and pen, as if those relics of the rational world might shield her from whatever slept below. But within 5 steps, she realized how foolish the gesture was. The light from her torch seemed unwilling to stretch far. It fell against the stone like a hesitant breath, absorbed rather than reflected. Her own shadow bent the wrong way on the wall, leaning ahead of her like a guide who had walked this path before. The air grew colder, but not sharply. It was the slow, aching chill of something that had never seen fire or sun. Her skin prickled, her fingertips numbed. Her ears began to ring. She kept going. There were no cobwebs, no moisture on the stone, no insects, just smooth, damp walls and steps worn down not by time but by repetition, by footfalls passed down like a ritual. It was too perfect, too rounded, too clean. A place designed not for use, but for passage. After what felt like hours, though she knew it was likely minutes, she reached the bottom. The room she entered was not large, but it felt boundless. The ceiling, if there was one, vanished into darkness. The floor was made of ancient tiles, each engraved with symbols she could not read but vaguely recognized, the way one might recognize a shape from a half-remembered dream. In the center of the chamber was a well, not of water, but of mirrors. Dozens of them. Arranged in a tight circle facing inward, their frames mismatched and deteriorated, some gold-leafed, some wrought iron, one made of what looked like bone. But the glass in each was flawless. Pristine. Each held its own image, not of her, not of the room, but of moments. Flickering scenes. Children weeping at desks, a woman screaming underwater, a man peeling the skin from his face with steady hands, and one, horribly, of Elise herself, sleeping in her bed, breathing slowly while something moved behind the curtain. She staggered back, almost dropping the flashlight. Her breath came ragged and uneven, and the light flickered in response, the bulb dimming as her fear rose, like the house itself was feeding off the imbalance in her chest. Then a sound. So soft she might have imagined it. A whisper echoing up from the mirrored well, not through her ears, but into her mind, a wordless sensation translated into language by something older than speech. You are the vessel. She fell to her knees. Not from pain, from the unbearable pressure behind her eyes, as if her thoughts were being sifted, inspected one by one, every memory exposed, every silence interrogated. She felt her past pulled forward, her mother's empty stare at the breakfast table, the smell of antiseptic in the hospital hallway, her uncle's voice humming behind closed doors while she lay in a bed she did not belong to. The house knew her, had known her long before she arrived. It had reached through bloodlines, through history, through names that had become stories, and now it had her. She looked down into the mirrors. They began to shift. No longer random moments, but faces. Rows and rows of them pressed against the inside of the glass, not screaming but waiting. Pale, silent, mouths open, throats swollen with the words they had swallowed for the house. And there, among them, the face of her uncle. Eyes sunken, mouth wide, blood trailing from his ears. He did not look at her. He looked through her. And the message was clear. He had come this far. He had seen the root beneath the stone. He had not spoken. So now it would be her voice the house required. Elise rose slowly. Her legs trembled. The air tasted like rust and something sweet, something cloying and wrong. She stepped to the edge of the mirrored pit, and when she opened her mouth, not to scream, not to speak, but merely to breathe, the mirrors breathed with her. She didn't remember speaking. Not at first. It was more like being spoken through, like the words had already existed in the walls for centuries and had simply been waiting for her mouth to open wide enough for them to escape. The sounds that came from her throat were not her own. They had weight, mass, temperature. Each syllable dragged through her body like rusted metal pulled across bone. She felt them, those words, rising from below the house, from beneath the soil and stone, from the mirrors that trembled with unuttered screams, and when they passed her lips, the air changed. The pit of mirrors no longer reflected anything. They turned dark, like still water after a storm. She stumbled backward, throat raw, lungs burning as though she'd been holding her breath for hours. Her vision blurred around the edges, and the spiral staircase seemed impossibly far above her, like a path out of a dream that no longer remembered how to end. Something in her chest screamed to flee, not for safety, but for silence. A silence she now feared the house would never allow again. But the voice in the dark, the presence that had pulsed beneath her bones for days, had stopped. The pressure lifted. The breath in the walls ceased. The house paused. It was not peace, not quite. More like the aftermath of a long-awaited meal. The house was sated, and she, Elise, was somehow still whole. Not untouched, but spared. She did not remember the climb. One moment she stood at the edge of the mirror pit, every muscle in her body screaming. The next, she found herself upstairs, standing barefoot in the hallway, the tapestry fluttering gently behind her, though there was no wind. Her hands were shaking. Her mouth felt bruised, like she had been biting down on something hard in her sleep. Her ears rang with silence. Not just the absence of noise, but true, aggressive silence. The kind that hummed at the edges of perception, daring her to listen too closely. she turned away from the hidden door. She did not lock it. She did not look into any of the mirrors. She walked to the front of the house and reached for the knob, expecting resistance, a final test, a last act of defiance from the place that had nearly swallowed her. But the door opened. Softly, like it had never meant to keep her. Outside, the trees were still blackened, the sky overcast, the air thick with humidity and rot. And yet everything felt foreign, as if she had stepped into someone else's dream. The wind carried no bird song. The gravel beneath her feet made no sound. The world outside had not changed, but she had, and the difference between her and the air around her was now too vast to ignore. She walked until she reached the old village road where her car waited, covered in leaves and dust. She turned the key. The engine started on the first try. The house did not follow. It took Elise nearly a week to stop flinching every time she passed a mirror. At first, she covered them all, then she broke 2. But eventually, exhaustion won. They remained uncovered, unbroken, still. She moved into a new apartment, a high-rise, steel and white walls. No wood, no stone. She left the iron key in a drawer somewhere, though she never quite forgot where. Some nights she held it in her palm and stared at it for hours without blinking. The voice never returned. Not fully. But sometimes, in moments of weakness, just after waking, or in the middle of a crowded cafe, or when her mind wandered during conversation, she would feel her throat tighten. Her vocal cords would hum softly, involuntarily, as if testing themselves. And a word would rise. Not a real word, a sound, round and heavy and half-born. Each time she swallowed it, she had learned the cost of giving it shape. One morning, in the fog of sleep, she saw herself in the mirror across the room. Not a reflection, her actual self, as though she had stepped out of her own body. That second, Elise leaned forward slightly, smiled, and whispered, "It's still listening." And then she woke. She never returned to the house. But sometimes letters arrived. Thick paper, no return address, her name written in sharp, angular strokes. She never opened them, but she never threw them away either. They waited in a shoebox under her bed, resting quietly in the dark. And sometimes, when the city fell into that deep, unnatural silence just before dawn, she would press her ear to the wall and listen, not for voices, but for breath.